Emily took out the ribbon that Ashel wanted to give to Cyan, and while she was holding it with both hands, Brian asked her if this was what Ashel had given to Cyan, to which she replied yes. He put a hand under his chin, began to look at the ribbon with a suspicious glance, and thought this was strange. He did not have a good feeling about this. Emily was left open-mouthed and with a confused look asked him if there was something wrong. Brian began to stare at the ribbon and with a serious look explained to her that Ashel had never sent gifts to Cyan before. He began to imagine Cyan and Ashel turning their backs on each other, and although this was just an observation, he had always felt that Cyan harbored resentment against Ashel, something that seemed much deeper than trivial family issues. At that moment, Nana, who was behind them, called their attention and told Brian they had to run. He turned around and with a confused look asked her why. Emily, who was holding the ribbon, simply remained silent. While Nana's body was surrounded by a stifling energy, her eyes returned to those of a dragon. She began to stare at Brian and told him that something dangerous was coming. Brian couldn't help but be somewhat surprised, and with a puzzled look began to wonder if she was alright. Emily couldn't help but be shocked since she didn't know what had happened to her eyes. As they were trying to understand the situation, a strong explosion occurred behind them which destroyed the wall behind them into pieces, leaving them shocked. Both turned back. Brian began to unsheath the sword, clenched his teeth tightly and ordered her to get out of here. Emily started sweating and with a look full of fear began to wonder what had caused this explosion. A gigantic creature known as a high-ranking beast called Behemoth appeared. It had been the one that destroyed the wall. It stomped on the ground forcefully, and while its body was surrounded by powerful energy, it began to stare at them. At the same time, in another part of the palace, people began fleeing towards the exit. Among the crowd was also Drenian. He started running with all his might, clenched his teeth and thought he was finished since at this rate he was going to end up dead. Several minutes ago, Drenian managed to get out of there faster than anyone else, but once he reached the main door, he encountered the most puppets who did not want to let anyone leave the palace. While he was running, he began to sweat even more, and with a desperate look decided to get out of here alive since he had to return safe and sound. He began to remember his maid, who was tied by the arms, was sitting in a chair, and was all injured. He wanted to return safe and sound since he wanted to see his lovely little maid named Lily. For this reason, he could not afford to die here. Thinking of her, he couldn't help but start to smile and get excited like a maniac. Now he also wanted to see Sarika all torn up too. He turned his head back and asked the knight if he was sure that the back doors were secure. The blonde-haired knight who was running behind him began to look at him and replied with an "I think so." Drenian panicked and with a furious look asked him if he was pulling his leg and also if he didn't know who he was. Just before he could finish speaking, someone cut his head in half. One of the puppets grabbed Drenian by the head and using the sword made a precise cut which split his head in half. As Drenian's lifeless body was falling to the ground, he began to stare at it intently with a sinister look. Seeing that Marquis Drenian had been murdered, the blonde-haired knight couldn't help but gape, while on the other side, the woman next to him placed her hands on her cheeks, opened her mouth, and with a look full of fear, began to scream. Drenian's body fell to the ground. The puppet threw his head to one side and several more puppets appeared. The knights in front could not help but start trembling with fear as they knew they were screwed. At that moment, water droplets began to float in front of the blonde-haired knight, who was somewhat confused as he did not know where the water had come from. The person who had summoned the water was Alice. She unsheathed her sword, used the skill called Aqua Explosion, swung the sword forcefully and launched a powerful slash towards the puppets, causing their bodies to be thrown backwards. After launching the attack, she began to stare intently at the puppets and gave Lunav the order to attack now. She decided to listen to her, reached out her hand towards them and used the ability called Freeze, making ice appear which began to advance towards them. Now that the bodies of the puppets were in the air, and they could not dodge the attack, the ice reached them and struck fully against them. Her attack was so powerful that the bodies of the puppets froze instantly. Alice landed on top of the ice, and since Lunav had used a lot of energy to launch the attack, she ran out of energy and fell to her knees on the ground. The people around began to look at the ice and could not help but be impressed. The knights were speechless when they saw that they had killed those monsters in an instant and could not help but start wondering who they were. Alice turned around, began to look at the knights, introduced herself as Alice, and told them that this was not over yet and also asked them to please protect the princess. Lunav lost a lot of strength, fell to her knees on the ground and started breathing heavily, and seeing this, Aaron approached her and decided to help her. The knight began to look at her and asked if she was okay. Aaron turned towards him and replied that she was fine but added that Lunav needed help. Just before she could finish speaking, Lunav caught her attention and while her arm was trembling, With a sincere look, she asked her not to worry about her as she would recover soon. Erin placed her hand on her back, crouched down, and with a worried look asked her if she was sure. Luna turned her head towards her and with a tired voice asked her to leave here since their next attack was going to start soon. Erin began to look at the ground with a lost gaze and fell silent. She did not know what was happening. The knights gathered around Princess Erin, took a defensive stance, and the blonde-haired knight decided to protect the princess. He gave the order to the other knights to get into formation. At that moment, Alice descended to the ground and decided to provide support, leaving the knights somewhat confused. She began looking at the guardian knights and ordered them to use barriers to protect the nobles. They needed to hold out until the battle was over. She began to look at the royal knights and gave them the order to protect the princess and support her if she fell. Although they did not know who she was or where she had come from, they remained listening in silence. Alice gripped the sword tightly, began walking towards the puppets, and while her body was surrounded by a powerful energy, with a look full of determination, she decided to do everything she could to stop these things. She began to stare at the puppets and realized that even if she kept knocking them down, more would appear from another place. The ground was full of puppet corpses. More puppets appeared and started walking towards her. According to her, it was as if they knew where they were at all times. The pendant that Princess Erin wore began to emit an evil energy similar to that of the puppets. She and Luna began to look at them and went on alert. Seeing that the puppets were approaching, Alice asked them to prepare for attack. The red jewel that was inside the pendant was what was emitting the evil energy. This energy was almost invisible and could not be seen with the naked eye. The behemoth stomped on the ground forcefully, shattering it into pieces, and prepared to attack. Brian grabbed the sword with both hands, adopting a defensive stance and prepared to fight, while on the other side, Emily hid behind him and panicked. She placed a hand on Brian's shoulder, began to cry, and asked him to do something. Brian kept calm, started to look at the behemoth and asked her to stay behind him. The behemoth began to approach them, and while its body was surrounded by intense energy, it began to look at them and prepared to attack. Brian soon realized that for a high-ranking monster to appear in the palace, something must be happening, as Cyan had said. Emily clung to Brian's back and she began to tremble with fear. Until now he had Cyan by his side to protect him, but now he needed to be able to defend himself. Brian kept calm so as not to appear weak, and while a drop of sweat was falling from his forehead, he thought that he was the only one who could protect the two of them right now. Emily clung to Brian's back and clenched her fist and told him that she believed in him. Having her so close, he began to blush like a tomato. The behemoth opened its mouth, began to approach them, and prepared to attack. Brian grabbed the sword with one hand, started looking at it, and seeing that it was approaching, he asked Emily not to separate from him. The behemoth raised its paw in the air and launched a powerful attack towards them, but just before the attack could hit, Brian swung the sword strongly and blocked the attack. After blocking the attack, Brian couldn't help feeling happy and began to smile, thinking that winning was possible. At that moment, the behemoth launched a chain of attacks towards them. Luckily, Brian reacted in time and began to block them using the sword, but due to the difference in strength, his body was thrown backwards. He began to block the attacks, and little by little his strength began to exhaust. Emily, who was hidden behind him, started crying and asked him if he was okay. He replied with a yes and asked her not to worry since he was going to protect her. While he was distracted, the behemoth appeared right in front of them, opened its mouth and prepared to attack. This had happened in a fraction of a second. As it was slowly approaching, Brian couldn't help but panic and with a look full of fear began to wonder if this was the end. He also apologized to Cyan. But at that moment, someone took momentum, jumped, and just before the behemoth could attack, struck it hard on the head, causing its body to hit the ground, shattering it into pieces. Brian started to look up and was left open-mouthed. Emily, who was hidden behind him, peeked out a bit and was shocked to see what had appeared in front of them. Several seconds later, someone with wings descended to the ground. This person was Nana, and her body was surrounded by powerful energy. Her attack was so strong that the behemoth lost consciousness. Brian and Emily began to wonder if she really was Nana. She turned her head back, and while her eyes were shining, she began to look at them and started smiling. Outside the palace, the moon came out. At the same time, inside, the puppets unsheathed their swords and began to run towards Alice and the others. Princess Erin began to look at them with an aggressive gaze, clenched her teeth tightly, extended her hands towards them, and invoked some golden magical circles. Several puppets tried to attack a knight, but he reacted in time, and using his sword cut one of their bodies in half. Alice began to move at a high speed, and using the sword she began to massacre the puppets. After finishing with several, she descended to the ground. She was somewhat tired and had scratches all over her face, She turned her head back, and with a serious look realized that this was never going to end at this rate. She didn't know who was behind this, but she was sure they had planned it thoroughly. The puppets began to fight against the knights, and Alice quickly realized that the knights were also going to get tired soon. They needed a different solution. During the battle, one of the knights struck one of the puppets in the face, causing the mask to detach from his face. While the puppets were running, the mask fell to the ground, and seeing what had appeared in front of her, Alice couldn't help but be shocked and go on alert at the same time. Now that the puppet no longer had his mask on, it could be seen that he was an undead. He gripped his sword tightly and began to roar. It didn't take long for Alice to realize that these puppets had been resurrected with dark magic. She began to fight against them, clenched her teeth tightly, and started thinking about a magic that was opposite to dark magic. Using the sword, she began to cut the puppets into pieces, and the first thing that came to her mind was the god of light, Lumendal, and his light magic. His light magic was so powerful that he could eliminate the undead without much effort. If someone could cast a light spell, there might be a chance for them to win. With a surprised look, she came to the conclusion that this was the only way to win. While the knights were fighting, Princess Erin extended her hands to the sides, began invoking golden magic circles, causing a golden barrier to appear around the bodies of the knights. Alice caught her attention. Upon hearing her voice, Erin started looking at her and couldn't help but be somewhat confused. Alice began to look at her and asked her to please imbue her sword with her mana. Erin explained to her that she could not do this since the knight's protection spell would break if she imbued her sword with mana. Two puppets appeared behind them, but the knight turned around and using the sword ended them without much effort. After doing this, he asked the princess not to worry about them. He turned his head towards her and with a cheerful smile, he explained to her that they could hold on a little longer, asking her to please trust them. Princess Erin turned around, started looking at him with a surprised look and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. With a confident look, she nodded her head and seeing that they were going to be able to hold on a little longer, she decided to imbue Alice's sword with her mana. She used the Blessing Light ability, causing a golden barrier to appear around Alice's body. While her sword was emitting Erin's mana, she began to look at the sword and seeing that it was working, she couldn't help but start to smile. While a drop of sweat was falling from her cheek and her eyes were shining, she thought that although it was difficult to combine two types of mana, if she added spiritual magic, things could change and could flow as smoothly as butter. While the puppets were slowly approaching, she grabbed the sword with both hands, and the spirit of a woman made of water appeared above her. She began to look at them and started to smile. She was still not sure if this was going to work, but she seemed fine taking a risk for this. On the ground was the corpse of a puppet and the roots of the mandrake plant. Someone approached the puppet's corpse and soon realized that it was an undead. This person was none other than Cyan. He picked up the mask, began to observe it, and soon came to the conclusion that he was already helping Ashel, and also that this is when Boris had become a subordinate of Ashel. Kara manifested. She began to look at the mask and explained to him that this was dark magic of necromancy type. She could not believe that there was a human today using such ancient magic. Cyan, who was holding the mask, with a serious look explained to her that there was a tactic that this guy used very frequently. He began to imagine a stun stone and revealed to her that he was using the tactic called acceleration of monster strengthening using stun stones. He also added that apparently the mana from that stone attracted monsters. Taram began to look in the direction where Alice and the others were, and she explained to him that she could feel the mana from the stun stones coming from that area. Cyan remained calm and thought that this whole place was a bloodbath. Next to them was the corpse of a waiter. He decided to continue but first decided to change his clothes. While the puppets were slowly approaching, Alice invoked the spirit of a woman, who began to stare at them with an angry look. The spirit created a blizzard which began to advance in all directions. Erin was somewhat surprised since she did not know what was happening. Lunav was shocked, and it didn't take long for her to realize that this was the spirit Marion. She didn't know if Alice had used light-type mana to summon her temporarily. She began to imagine light surrounded by water. Mana couldn't be exchanged with others, so she wasn't going to be able to hold on for a long time in such an unstable state. While a drop of sweat was falling from her cheek, with a perplexed look she began to look at Alice and told Erin that they had to stop her, otherwise her body was going to break. Alice firmly grabbed the sword and Marion's spirit became more powerful. Marion put a hand on top of her head, approached her, called her girl, and asked why she was sacrificing herself. Alice began to look at the ground with a sad gaze and told her that she had not come up with another way to defeat the puppets. Upon hearing this, Marion thought it was a shame, as this was a very cruel fate for a girl who had been blessed by Fruina. While the two of them were talking, the puppets gained momentum, began to approach her and prepared to attack. Marion put her hands near her face, began to stare intently at the puppets, and seeing that they were unpleasant beings, she ordered them to move away. At that moment, water began to gather around her fingers. Just before they could attack, Marion extended her hands to the sides and her mana began to repel the puppets, causing their bodies to be thrown backwards. Marion's attack began to gradually disintegrate the undead. Erin put her hand near her face, and she couldn't help but be amazed at how much strength a single movement of her hand had. Lunav also put her hand near her face and told her that the attack was not going to have an effect on the puppets, as they were getting up. The puppets that had been attacked slowly began to stand up again as if nothing had happened. Erin panicked, started screaming, and asked Alice to stop because she was going to die if she kept pushing herself more. Despite being very injured, with a determined look, Alice refused because she knew the situation would only get worse if she stopped here. The people around, including the knights, were filled with fear. Upon realizing this, she decided to end this. She grabbed the hilt of the sword with both hands, forcefully stabbed it into the ground, closed her eyes, and used the Spirit King's authority skill called Rongomiant. This caused Marion to bring her hands together towards the puppets and prepare to launch a powerful water-based attack. But just before Alice could give her the order to attack, someone wearing white gloves appeared and grabbed her arm. Seeing who this person was, even Marion was somewhat confused. Alice began to sweat, and with a perplexed look she began to wonder what was happening. Princess Erin was shocked as she didn't know what was happening. Lunav, who was behind her, also remained in shock as she didn't know who this person was or where they had come from. A man wearing the same mask as the puppets appeared, and while holding a dagger in one hand, he grabbed Erin's arm with the other. This man was different from the puppets because his mask was surrounded by a powerful fog. Feeling his hand, Alice opened her eyes and couldn't help but wonder who this guy was. While the man's body was surrounded by a stifling energy, he began to stare at her, and although at first she thought he was another puppet, she later realized that he wasn't, as he had a completely different aura. Gradually his energy started to approach her face. Seeing this, she panicked, started to sweat, and with a confused look began to wonder what this fog was. He grabbed her arm even harder, and the fog began to surround her body. She tried to move but was unable. The fog that his body was emitting became more intense, and he started staring at her intently. She began to exert force and tried to move backwards but was unable. She clenched her teeth tightly and with a look full of fear realized that she was going to be consumed by the fog. Marion also noticed this and she told Alice that this was a goodbye. Upon hearing this, she became somewhat confused as she did not know what was happening. Marion extended her hands to the sides and with a sincere look explained that she believed this was the end of her journey, adding that farewells could be somewhat sad but joyful. But at that moment, the man let go of her arm and little by little the fog began to disappear. Alice fell to the ground. While with one hand she was holding the sword, she put the other on the ground. Her body was surrounded by fog and she had no strength in her body and did not know if it was because of this fog. While little by little the fog was sucking Alice's energy, Marion's voice began to sound and she asked her to remember that Fruina would always receive her with open arms. While Alice was holding the sword with one hand, she turned around and saw that Marion had already disappeared and had turned into water. Princess Erin was left speechless and with a surprised look asked Lunav what had happened. Lunav kept calm. She began to stare at the man and explained to her that he had blocked the mana to nullify the manifestation of the spirit. She did not know if he was something or someone, or even if he was a human. While the man's body was surrounded by intense fog, he began to look at them and remained silent. The puppets started running towards them and prepared to attack. Alice, who was lying on the ground with her hand resting on the sword, raised her head and seeing that the puppets were approaching and ready to attack, she panicked and thought this was the end. One of the puppets jumped and prepared to attack. The man turned towards them, drew his dagger, held it close to his face, and prepared to block the attack. Just before the puppets could make another move, he began to move at a great speed and using the dagger he began to cut their bodies in half. Witnessing this, Alice couldn't help but be somewhat confused as she couldn't believe that he was on their side. After finishing off several puppets, he stopped attacking, and while holding the dagger with one hand, he put his knee on the ground, began to look at the floor and came to a halt. Then, he raised his head and upon seeing what was happening, he couldn't help but be in shock. Instead of attacking him, the puppets began to ignore him and started running towards Princess Erin and the others. He stood up, began to look at the puppets and realized that if he took even a small step back, all of them would be attracted to the princess's group. According to him, it was as if they were strongly attracted to something. This man was none other than Cyan Vert. He began to observe the puppets and asked Karam if she could feel a special type of mana from someone in the princess's group. She asked him if apart from that girl Lunav, to which he replied no, adding that she was like that. As the puppets were slowly approaching, Princess Erin and Lunav began to stare at them with a serious look and prepared to defend themselves. Karam revealed to Cyan that she could feel a mana like that of a monster from the princess's necklace. Cyan began to smile and decided to shorten the distance all at once and also asked her for help. Karam couldn't help but get angry when she saw that he only needed her in these types of situations. Cyan put his hand on the ground and used the creation ability called Space. By doing this, his hand began to emit a powerful fog. While little by little the puppets were advancing towards Princess Erin and the others, Cyan used the ability called Fog Domain, causing the fog to begin expanding everywhere. In the blink of an eye, the fog began to cover the entire room, and they were teleported to another space. As the fog was gradually consuming the entire room, the knights began to panic. The black-haired knight started looking around and asked others to be careful since no one knew what could be inside the fog. The blonde-haired knight began to inspect the place, and with a surprised look, he told the others that it was as if they were in a different place. Despite being in another space, the puppets did not stop and kept running towards them. But at that moment, black fog began to appear on the ground, and just before they could take another step, the ground turned into fog, leaving all the puppets motionless. They began to look down and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. Gradually, the black fog began to rise up the bodies of the puppets and started consuming them. Alice was shocked to see that the black fog was consuming the puppets. While she had both knees on the ground, in front of her eyes, the black fog consumed all the puppets. With a surprised look, she began to wonder what was happening and where this black fog had come from. Several seconds later, once the fog curtain began to disappear, it could be seen that there was no trace of the puppets. Now the place was quiet as if nothing had happened. Princess Erin was perplexed to see that he had killed all the puppets. She did not know who this masked man was. Lunav, who was next to her, began to breathe heavily until several seconds later, she fainted and fell to the ground. Erin turned to one side, and upon seeing this, she couldn't help but panic. She approached Lunav and asked her to stand up. While she was distracted, a hole made of black fog appeared behind her. Cyan emerged from the hole, appeared behind Erin, and while his eyes were shining, he put his hand on her shoulder. Feeling his hand, she couldn't help but start to feel intense terror. She let out a scream, and hearing her scream, the knights turned around to see what was happening. Cyan grabbed Erin by the neck, pulled out the dagger and put it close to her neck. The knights surrounded him and asked him what he was doing and ordered him to let her go right now. Cyan held onto her neck even tighter, moved a bit closer to her and began staring intently at the knights. She grabbed Cyan by the arm, clenched her teeth tightly due to fear, and couldn't help but wonder who he was since he seemed quite familiar to her. Just before the knights could make a move, Cyan struck the jewel that was on the princess's necklace with the tip of his dagger, shattering it into pieces. The black-haired knight panicked and thought he had attacked the princess, while on the other hand, the blonde-haired knight firmly grasped his sword, and with an aggressive look decided to finish off Cyan. Alice was in shock. She turned around and couldn't help but worry about Erin. Using the sword, the knight attacked Cyan, but just before the attack could hit him, he turned into fog and disappeared. The knight thought he had finished him off, but the black fog began to pass by his side. Feeling this, he went into shock and began to question what this fog was. Behind them was Lunav passed out on the ground. Cyan transformed into black fog and while holding the dagger with one hand, appeared and sat next to her body. Princess Erin turned around and upon seeing this, she panicked and imagined that the worst was going to happen. She ordered Cyan to stay away from Lunav. Cyan ignored her, put his hand on Lunav's body, and slowly the black fog began to enter her body. Princess Erin became furious, and with an angry look, she extended her hand towards him and used the ability called God's Stinger and launched a powerful golden ray towards him. Cyan turned his head towards her, and upon seeing the attack, he quickly realized that this was not good. A golden ray hit his body, and his body transformed into fog again. While the palm of Princess Erin's hand was surrounded by golden rays and she had her hand extended towards him, she began to sweat and was somewhat surprised to see that he had turned into fog. Cyan's voice began to sound and he asked her not to worry as he was not trying to harm her. He had destroyed the jewel, so now the monsters would not be attracted to her. Princess Erin began touching her necklace with a worried look and asked him if the necklace that her brother had given her was a trap. The fog that was around them and had created this space began to disappear. Cyan asked her to go through the back doors and leave the palace since he had cleared the way for her. As the fog was slowly disappearing, she began to look up, and it didn't take long for her to realize that everything was returning to normal. The blonde-haired knight began to put away his sword, approached her, and with a worried look asked her if she was injured anywhere. Princess Erin didn't know who that man was. She started looking around. She told the knight that she was fine and also asked him about Alice and Lunav. Lunav regained consciousness, and she was sitting, although her arm was over the wound on her other arm. Alice approached her, put both hands on her shoulders, caught Erin's attention, and decided it would be best to recover and leave through the main door as that man had said. Erin turned around, and seeing that both were okay, she couldn't help but feel relieved and happy. Although Lunav had regained consciousness, she was without strength. Erin, who had a hand resting on her shoulder, began to look at her with a worried gaze and decided to think about that man later, since now getting these girls to safety was her first priority. At that moment, Lunav's eyes began to shine, and she started to wonder if that man was Cyan. At the same time, in another part of the palace lay the lifeless corpse of the behemoth. Near the area there was someone standing who had a purple tail. This person was none other than Nana. She wore a purple armor and was covered in blood. Emily grabbed Brian's arm tightly, and while tears were falling from her eyes, with a look full of fear, she asked him who this girl was and if he was sure that she was a maid. Brian began to look at Nana and explained to her that he wasn't very sure since he had never seen her like this before. While Nana's body was surrounded by powerful energy, she jumped up and started to fly. In Cyan's past life, on the day of the banquet, the sky turned red and there was a rumor about the blood banquet incident that had resulted in the death of many people. The behemoth and puppets killed many people, and the rumor was that the person behind the incident was none other than the 5th princess of the empire, Erin Severus, who had been blinded by her desire to seize power. It had been caused by Day's stone. It was very likely that Ashel or Lionel had given it to her. After that incident, they were praised as heroes of the empire and were the ones who benefited most from that incident. At the same time, night fell and the moon came out. While Cyan was holding the puppet's mask with one hand, Karam asked him if they had invented this whole incident for their own benefit. She began to look sideways, and with a serene gaze she asked him if they really had sacrificed those of their own kind for their own benefit, adding that sometimes she felt humans were worse than demons. Cyan, who was sitting on top of the palace roof, explained to her that this was nothing compared to what they were going to do in the future. He began to look down and with a lost look thought that he had helped with worse massacres than this in his past life, so maybe he was worse than them. Karam transformed into a human. She sat next to him, started looking at him, and asked if it was time to leave. Cyan stood up, and while his eyes were closed, he began to clean his shirt with his hand and responded with a yes, adding that he was sure Nana was waiting. He decided it was time to leave since the palace knights were going to take care of the rest. Karam turned her head towards him, and with a serious look revealed that there was something bothering her about the princess's necklace. Cyan remained calm, started looking at her, and with a serene look asked her what bothered her about the necklace. She replied that his maid named Emily also smelled like Day's stone. Upon hearing this, Cyan's expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but be shocked and go on alert at the same time. At the same time in the palace, Nana opened her mouth, and while she was bleeding, she began to smile, and with a hungry look thought that Emily smelled delicious. Nana's body began to give off a powerful purple energy, and she started to approach them. Emily hid behind Brian, tightly gripping his arm, and began to cry. With a look full of fear, she explained to Nana that she didn't taste good at all. While with one hand Brian was holding the sword, he put the other in front to indicate to her to stop, and with a confused look he asked her to calm down. Deep down he did not know what was happening. While Nana's body was surrounded by a malignant energy, her eyes began to glow. She started to stare at them and began to walk towards them. She was acting like a monster. While a drop of sweat was falling from Brian's cheek, he started looking at her with a look full of fear, clenched his teeth tightly, and thought that for some reason Nana only wanted to go after Emily. When Nana was little, Brian used to carry her in his arms. One day while he was taking care of Nana, Karam appeared and started stroking her head. Nana, who was holding a stuffed animal with one hand, closed her eyes and began to drool with pleasure. Seeing this, Brian couldn't help but feel inner peace. Cyan, who was standing behind them, simply remained silent. Having said that, Brian could not hurt Nana. She quickly began to approach them. She started staring at Emily with a hungry look, and with a smile prepared her claw to finish her off as she could not wait any longer. Emily, who was hiding behind Brian, began to cry even more due to fear, and thought she was going to die. Brian tried to attack Nana, but he closed his eyes, started sweating, and clenched his teeth as he was unable to harm her. Using her sharp claw she attacked Emily, but at that moment, Cyan appeared and stood in the middle, causing her claw to hit his back. He opened his mouth and began screaming in pain. Nana had gained momentum and then launched the attack. Her attack was so powerful that Cyan's body was shot forward and a strong blizzard was created, which began to spread throughout the room. Brian, who had his eyes closed and was ready to receive the attack, put his hand near his face and became somewhat confused and surprised at the same time. He opened his eyes, turned towards Cyan, and seeing that he was injured, he couldn't help but panic and worry about him. Emily grabbed Brian's arm with both hands and she couldn't help but be somewhat surprised to see Cyan. While the two of them were distracted, Karam began to manifest and she started to appear behind them. Cyan began to bleed. He clenched his teeth tightly due to the pain. Then he started looking at Karam and asked her to hurry up. She appeared behind them, and without making a noise she took the ribbon that Ashel wanted to give to Cyan. After doing this, she informed him that she had found it. Emily hugged Brian's arm even tighter, turned around and couldn't help but panic and start crying because she didn't know who Karam was or where she had come from. She threw the ribbon to the ground, and seeing this, Emily thought that this was not good since this was the ribbon that Ashel had given her. Karam crossed her arms and began to step hard on the ribbon, destroying it into pieces. Witnessing this, Emily was terrified and asked her why she had done this. Brian turned around, started looking at the ribbon with a surprised look and simply remained silent. Karam began to look at Nana and with a scream, she asked her to recover once and for all, adding that her beloved father was here. Upon hearing the name of her father, Nana, who was gradually moving towards them, she slowly began to regain consciousness. Several seconds later, she lifted her head and upon seeing Cyan completely regained consciousness. While she was bleeding from the mouth, she began to cry and with a confused look started asking them what had happened here. In front of her was Cyan, who had a deep cut on his back. Seeing this, she asked them if she had done this to Cyan. He kept calm and asked her not to worry. He began looking at her and with a forced smile explained that it didn't hurt at all, adding that hurting him hadn't been her intention. He asked her not to worry since she had done nothing wrong. Nana, who had her hands full of blood, fell to her knees on the ground, began to look at Cyan with a sad look and could not help but start crying. Karam began to disappear. Seeing Cyan's wound, Brian couldn't help worrying about him. Emily, who was holding Brian's arm with one hand, put her other hand under her chin, started looking at him with a sad look and started crying. Nana had massacred the behemoth like a simple ant. She fell to her knees on the ground. Cyan approached her, crouched down and decided to leave this place as it was a disaster. At the same time, Lionel became enraged and began to wonder what was happening. He, Ashel, Aaron's father, and the other knights arrived at the main hall of the palace, which was empty. He began to inspect the area and could not help but panic since this place should be full of monsters. But however, it was as quiet as if they had never been here. Aaron's father, who was injured, passed his arm over Ashel's shoulder, drew Lionel's attention and with a calm look explained that he could not see any monster around. Ashel simply started looking at the ground. Lionel turned back and explained to his father that this was a relief since the situation had been resolved. With a serious look, Ashel began to stare intently at Lionel and remained silent in thought. While they were conversing, someone began to approach them and called the king father. Upon hearing this, the king started looking in the direction from which the voice had come and it didn't take him long to realize who it was. Alice, Aaron, Lunav and the other knights appeared and started running towards them. Aaron, who was leading, clenched her fists with a worried look on her face as she caught the king's attention. Upon seeing that Princess Aaron was well, the king couldn't help but feel relieved and began to smile. On the other hand, Ashel clenched his teeth tightly as the plan had not gone as they had planned. Aaron approached the king, she gave him a strong hug, closed her eyes and began to cry saying that she was very glad that he was okay. The king hugged her back and explained that he too was very happy to see that his daughter was well. Princess Aaron asked him if he was hurt anywhere. Several seconds later, she opened her eyes and couldn't help but be shocked at seeing Lionel. The king turned towards where Lionel and Ashel were, placed his hand on her shoulder and explained that he had been able to get here safely thanks to the two of them. Lionel began to stare at Aaron with a look full of hatred and told her that he was glad she wasn't dead. Aaron started looking at him and decided to stay calm. With a serene look she thanked him for worrying about her. Deep down she had a lot of questions to ask him. But first she needed to take care of the others. Alice and the brown-haired knight placed their hand over their chest, bowed down, closed their eyes and greeted the king. Lunav also put her hand on her chest and greeted the king. He turned around, extended his hand towards them and thanked them for having protected his youngest daughter, adding that he was going to reward them generously for this. Meanwhile, Ashel approached Lionel and they both started looking at them. Aaron turned her head back and noticed this. Ashel approached Lionel's ear and began to whisper something. Princess Erin started looking at them with a suspicious gaze and began to wonder what Ashel was telling Lionel. Several seconds later, Lionel started smiling like a madman. He drew his sword, pointed it at Lunav's neck, and revealed to everyone that he believed he knew the culprit behind this incident. She raised her head and with a confused look, she went on alert. While Lionel was pointing the sword at Lunav's neck, he began to smile and revealed to everyone that she was the granddaughter of the president of the Garam Wizards Association. According to him, now she was under arrest. Ashel, who was behind him and had his arms crossed, simply started looking at her and remained silent. Alice began to look at Lionel with a surprised look and she couldn't help but go into shock. She didn't know what he was trying to do. Ashel and Lionel began to stare intently at Lunav with a serious look. The king lost his composure, started yelling and told Lionel that he was crossing the line, ordering him to lower his sword. Princess Erin panicked and with a surprised look she explained to him that Lunav had saved many people along with her. Lionel began to smile and told them that it had only been a trick, adding that the kingdom of Garam had always been waiting for an opportunity to attack the Ushif Empire. He began to bring his sword closer to her neck and bet that her goal was an assassination with the intention of creating chaos within the empire. Lunav remained calm and with a serene look she told him that he was speaking as if he had proof of this. Ashel approached the king, he put his hand on his chest, closed his eyes, bowed his head before him and explained that last night he had detected a suspicious mana aura at the place where she was staying. The king began to stare at him and asked if this was true. Princess Erin started to sweat and with a look of panic asked her father not to believe what Ashel was saying. The king told them both that it would be better if they were smart with their words. Lionel turned his head back and with a serious look explained that he had invited them to try to convey their desire for peace, but he had been watching them as a precaution. He also added that he was going to go look for evidence if given time. Despite the fact the king wasn't very sure, he decided to accept and wait for Lionel to find evidence. Princess Erin, who stood next to him, clenched her fist in desperation. Lionel began to look at Lunav and with a smug smile, asked the king to leave this in his hands. Despite being in this situation, she remained calm and it didn't take long for her to realize that this was a trap. She didn't know if this was also something that her grandfather had planned to happen. After this, Lunav Rainreaver was imprisoned along with her group from the Garam Mage Association for investigation. Leximus, who had been separated from Erin, worked with the other guardian knights to protect the nobles. After meeting with Erin, she gave her a strong hug and while crying, decided never to lose sight of her again. The funerals of Marquis Drenian, the younger brother of the Empress, as well as countless more people, were held in the streets. This time Cyan had been able to prevent many more deaths than in his past life. But even so, he couldn't change the fact that this banquet would be called the Blood Banquet. Cyan returned home, and someone began to bandage his back, explaining that the wound could have been much worse. The person who was putting on the bandages was Alice. While Cyan was sitting with both hands resting on his knees, he told her that she didn't need to do all of this. Alice closed her eyes and asked him to stay still, asking him to listen to her since she was his older sister. While she was bandaging Cyan's back, she closed her eyes and explained that it could have been really dangerous, and for this reason it had been good that he had run away from the banquet. Cyan began to look aside and told her that he had done well in running away from the banquet. She began to look down and with a lost gaze mentioned that if it hadn't been for that person that day, she would have also died. She started to remember the masked man and couldn't help but wonder who that person was. She realized that the height of this person was similar to Cyan's. He began to look into her eyes and simply remained silent. Alice put her hand over her mouth, closed her eyes, and realized he had gotten in shape and also had many scars, so she concluded he had been training very hard. Upon hearing this, Cyan began to look at her with a confused look, then he turned to one side and responded with a yes. Alice began to reach out her hand towards him and she realized that he was getting embarrassed. He got off the bed, and Alice asked him if she could touch his muscles. He started running towards the exit and asked her to stop making fun of him. At that moment, someone entered the room and was glad to see that Cyan had recovered very quickly. This person was Ashel. While with one hand he was holding the doorknob, he put the other inside his pants pocket, began to smile seeing that they were as close as ever. Now he was almost jealous. He also asked them if they were okay now. Cyan started looking at Ashel with a look full of hatred and resentment and replied that they were fine thanks to him. Alice began to observe Cyan and she quickly realized that he was suspicious of Ashel. He started to smile and asked him how the investigation was going. Alice began to stare at Ashel and wondered if Cyan also knew that he had a vile and cruel side. He reached out towards the ceiling with a smile, explaining that in reality, he had come here for the investigation. He revealed to them that a bracelet with an embedded stun stone had been found in Lunav's room. He approached them and mentioned that she claimed it had been given to her. Cyan, who was standing in front of him, realized that then the person who had given her the bracelet should be on the suspect list. Ashel brought his hand to his face and couldn't help but start smiling when he saw that Cyan was smart. He began to stare at him and asked if he remembered receiving anything from someone during the banquet. Cyan put his hand under his chin and began to think. With a suspicious look, he asked him if he knew who had given that bracelet to Lunav. He started looking at the ground and explained that he had heard there was a merchant in the palace who had been found dead today, and for this reason, he was looking for them. After saying this, he started staring at Cyan again and asked him if he had received anything that day. Cyan couldn't help but start to smile, as he realized that this was not an investigation, but he was trying to create a scapegoat. At the same time, somewhere else in the city, there was a woman sitting on a bench and she was whistling. While she was enjoying the views, someone carrying a sword appeared behind her. The woman was Emily. She slightly turned her head back and with a confused look began to wonder who this person was. Cyan knew she was in danger. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.